Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'll start with a small correction. In the last podcast, I mentioned Ukraine's domestically produced Flamingo jet-powered cruise missile as having a 1,000-kilometre range. This was wrong. The actual range is 3,000 kilometres, meaning targets in all of European Russia and even some areas beyond the Urals can be destroyed. And I note in passing that yet another of Donald Trump's deadlines to Russia has passed with no further action, or maybe renaming the Department of Defense the War Department counts, though it sounds totally childish to me. Anyway, when President Trump was being quizzed by a journalist about doing nothing when it came to Russia, his reply was this now standard line about sanctions being placed on India for importing Russian oil. Now, that's all well and good. My own belief, as I've explained, is that the sanctions are to punish India for not going along with the fabrication that Trump solved the recent conflict with Pakistan. This is in the hope, the obsession, it would seem, of being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But we all circle back to the same thing, that if Trump really actually wanted to punish Russia, then why not impose sanctions directly on that country? Still in Europe, last week, the US Department of Defense, the War Department, informed European countries that military support under a program known as Section 333 will be cut to zero from next financial year. That is military support, particularly that had been going to the Baltic frontline nations facing Russia. Now, the basic message is, it's becoming increasingly apparent, I think, to everyone, that Donald Trump is not a friend of democracies. And when I say everyone, that's a message that our own government and security experts seem remarkably unwilling to accept. But this is the new reality. If it suits the US to throw Australia under a bus we will be thrown. And there's no point pretending otherwise. And I'm not even sure that current US hostility towards China is immune from various carve-outs and special deals, potentially to the detriment of Australia. Indeed, my guess is that the US will focus more on defence of the homeland and that hemisphere, including parts of South America, under Trump, which risks leaving Australia out in the cold, and I'll come back to that. But this gives rise to the thought, if Ukraine can develop such weapons, 3,000-kilometre range cruise missiles with a 1-ton warhead, what's wrong with Australia? Okay, I accept that Ukraine is at war, and therefore there's a great sense of urgency, which we lack here, but the Ukrainian economy is smaller than Australia's, and their population base is only a very small amount larger. Why is it that we continue to depend on imported solutions, particularly imported US solutions? Now, this is just another thought as our guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise struggles to deliver anything other than stockpiling some US missiles, despite having access to billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. And maybe our Guio people should speak with Ukraine about how they have done it. I've previously recommended speaking with South Korea. Add Ukraine onto the list. And on things that upset me, C-3000. The situation with secrecy and non-disclosure agreements is beyond ridiculous, because I spoke last week, out of curiosity, with one of the early unsuccessful bidders, a representative of a company that had been eliminated more than 12 months ago, and I asked whether they had had their official debrief from Defence about why they had been eliminated and what were those reasons. And I was absolutely stunned to be told, I cannot tell you, I cannot even say whether or not we have had a debrief. And I said, because of these ongoing NDAs, and the answer to that was yes. And I said, well, when do they lapse? And he said, never, never. This is the situation that we live in, where companies involved in the process can never breathe a single word about what was in their bid. There is no logic to it. It's a ridiculous suppression of information that is hurting the country, and I'll explain very briefly why. All of this talk about moving production of the general purpose frigates to the Henderson precinct in Western Australia is just so much hot air. It has no substance to it. When I speak with people in industry, almost no one believes that it will ever happen. They believe that the production run will just continue in Japan for all 8 or 11 frigates, or however many we end up getting. And no matter how often Richard Marles and Pat Conroy talk about thousands of well-paid Australian jobs building frigates, it's just not going to happen, because guess why? None of the companies involved can speak with each other or speak with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, because these non-disclosure agreements are still in place. It's such a self-defeating strategy. It has to stop. Surely that there's a minister, even if they're not directly connected with defence, who can just see how wrong all of this is. Surely there's somebody there with a conscience. And speaking of which, there was also a media trip to Woomera, a very elite select group, to see a flight of an MQ-28 Ghostbat. I wasn't on it. And again, I can see what's going on here. It's the department, the government, and the prime contractor, Boeing, starting to play media favourites. That's not a constructive path to go down. On top of that, we have new freedom of information laws in the pipeline, which will make access to information about the workings of government even more difficult to achieve rather than less. This is all going in the wrong direction. There's a chance that legislation will be blocked in the Senate, though I suspect if the coalition are true to form, they will end up backing the government, because they are just as obsessed about secrecy and a lack of transparency. Now, in the last podcast, I, of course, spent a bit of time talking about the flurry of activity around AUKUS Pillar 1, and clearly some Australians are spooked. Some Americans are spooked as well. There seem to be signals that the whole deal is imperiled. We had the strange visit of Richard Marles over there with a kind of passing meeting with War Minister Peter Hegseth. I would have thought a passing meeting was a huge slap in the face. I also saw that the former Defence Secretary, James Mattis, got together with Maurice Payne, Australia's previous and totally invisible foreign minister, to present some sort of paper boosting AUKUS. Who would care? No one knows who Maurice Payne is, and I would think that James Mattis is just hated by the current administration. They'll probably do more harm than good to the cause of AUKUS. But getting back to Richard Marles and the meeting with the War Minister, even though it only lasted about 5 minutes, I wonder what message he delivered to them. Obviously, he's gone over to soothe them about something. He wouldn't have just turned up with nothing to offer. So maybe it's a genuine increase in the defence budget, and not the illusory one that might or might not occur in the 2027-2028 financial year. But in that case, how dare our political leadership be telling the Americans this sort of stuff before they tell us? But unfortunately, this is now the new reality that we live in, particularly when it comes to AUKUS. The American government knows more about what is going on inside our Department of Defence than the people of Australia do. I regard that as a deeply unhealthy situation. The unreality of expecting that Australia is going to receive second-hand Virginia-class submarines, as usual, there's a complete disconnect between the actual problem, which is the Virginia-class SSN build rate, and our government's solution of greater political engagement and enthusiasm. And in some of the commentary, I have again seen a reference to a common submarine for the three navies, and I have no idea where this is coming from. It's very clear that there will be, if it goes ahead, it will be US SSNs and then followed by UK SSNs. They are quite different submarines, and on the current plan, Australia will be operating both. They will have different combat systems, different weapons, different nuclear reactors, different sensors, and different crewing requirements. But speaking of submarines, the huge military parade in Beijing to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in the Pacific showcased a lot of new weaponry, including very large autonomous underwater drones. These are the sorts of things that would attack enemy submarines unwise enough to enter the South China Sea. This is the reality today, so one can only imagine the level of technology that China will have developed by the mid-2030s, a decade from now. So which countries hope to operate crude submarines in the South China Sea a decade from now? Class, any ideas? Which countries? South China Sea? Well, China, obviously. But apart from China, the only one I can think of is Australia, because fairly much everyone else has given up on this thoroughly bad idea. The analogue would be an enemy of the US operating submarines in the Great Lakes or in the Gulf of Mexico, which I vaguely recall a US president might have tried to recently rename. Anyway, you get the picture. On submarine numbers, Virginia-class production is still languishing, and for an update, I'm indebted to Rear Admiral Peter Briggs, a retired submariner, known to many of us, who has crunched the numbers again. And in a submission to the Treaties Committee that I mentioned last week, he says, referring to Virginia, so I'm now going to quote because it's worth doing this in full because it has a lot of facts. He writes about the slow production rate. These problems will be compounded by an increase in the size and complexity of Virginia-class submarines being built. Once the remaining Block 4 7,800-ton submarines currently under construction are delivered, production will shift to the 10,200-ton Block 5 version. This is 31% larger and more complex than the Block 4. 10 of these larger versions are on order. Only 3 have been laid down. They are to be followed by 3 Block 6 submarines of a similar size and complexity. The new target, encompassing a Columbia ballistic missile firing submarine each year, and 2 of the larger Virginias, would require at least a 3-fold increase in submarine construction tonnage compared with the annual average build of 1.14 smaller versions of the Virginias actually achieved over the last 21 years, compared to the US Navy's target of delivering 2 Virginias each year over this period. That is a cumulative shortfall of 18 attack submarines. Then Peter Briggs turns to the UK. He details reliability problems with the Vanguard-class ballistic missile firing submarines and the fact that the new Dreadnought SSBNs are the highest priority for the UK. He then looks at the current Astute SSNs and writes, "The UK's second priority, the Astute program, is also a mess. Of the 5 submarines delivered, all years late and significantly over budget, currently none are at sea." Then in a series of dot points, he says, Astute, that's the first of class, has entered midlife refit, joining her sister ship Audacious in Devonport dry docks. Ambush is alongside in the submarine base in Faslane and has not been to sea for 3 years, along with her sister ship, Artful, which has not been to sea for 2 years. The fifth and final operational SSN, Anson, has just returned to Faslane. The final two of the class, are yet to be delivered. So clearly, on that evidence, the state of the UK submarine fleet is absolutely dismal. So if we aren't going to get submarines from either the US or the UK, we had better start thinking about who we will get them from, something that many of us have been urging for years. When I look at the possibility of the US withdrawing completely from the region and ask who our allies might be, the obvious one is France. France is an important Pacific power and for years has been making overtures to Australia about closer defence cooperation, and these overtures have been ignored. Or, in fact, in some cases, worse. We cancelled the attack class submarine program, and I was no fan of that because it was using very backward-looking technology. But the attacks could have been very easily morphed into nuclear-powered versions. Indeed, it was always part of the plan for the attacks to review propulsion options in 2027. No reason, if we were building them now, why, it couldn't be done right away. Anyway, that just didn't happen. Now, as it happens, France has reached a couple of key milestones just in the last few days in helping Brazil construct their first nuclear-powered submarine. This could have been Australia's future, but no, our governments, plural, wanted a return to the Anglosphere and the comfort of dining out in London and Washington, not needing waiters to translate the menu or having to explain what exotic-sounding dishes were. Just burgers and fish and chips, thank you very much. That's AUKUS at its heart. Let's get rid of these pesky Europeans. And also, say, largely French helicopters in the form of Taipan and Tigers, and replace them instead with older-style US helicopters. Now, a couple of times I've referenced events in China, shift in geopolitical circumstances. I spoke about that a lot in the last podcast. I mentioned the huge military parade with all sorts of new technologies on display, hypersonic missiles, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, anti-drone systems, all of that sort of stuff. As it happens, this might be my last podcast for certainly a week, possibly a fortnight, because I'm going to be travelling to China very shortly. And when you hear this podcast, I should have arrived in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang autonomous region in the far west. To give you an idea of how remote it is, it's a 4.5-hour flight from Beijing, so the equivalent of flying from Canberra to Perth. And the purpose of the visit is slightly unclear, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the Shanghai Cooperation Forum I've just referred to, or former Australian premiers being photographed alongside mass murderers. I was invited by the embassy here in Canberra about 2 months ago if I'd be interested in joining a media tour to Xinjiang, and my answer was, hypothetically yes, because I've never been there. And secondly, and more importantly, and this is relevant, I'm very interested in the geopolitics of Central Asia and the struggle for influence being played out in all of the stands between Russia and China. And Xinjiang basically shares borders with many of them, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, that sort of thing. And this also feeds into my one-person campaign to convince China that Taiwan isn't worth the bother, and instead China should seek to regain those vast, resource-rich territories of Manchuria and Siberia that it was forced to give up to Imperial Russia because of grotesquely unequal treaties that Peking back then, was forced to sign in 1858 and 1860. Now, the problem, of course, will be one of communications with the outside world. The Chinese people that I've been dealing with, the diplomats have been very open, explaining that there are heavy restrictions on the internet, their so-called Great Firewall of China. My phone hopefully will work. I've downloaded a VPN. I've never used one before. Anyway, this is a very long way of saying, if you don't hear from me for a fortnight, don't be concerned. If it's any longer than that, please contact your local member. I might need some help. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time, whenever that will be.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.